All right, the room is pretty full. I'm excited. This is great. We do work with you all throughout the year, but this is one of my favorite times. And it's one of my favorite times because I get to see all of you together. It's also one of my favorite times because this is the time each year when I pause to think about what I've learned from working with you all, to think about what the forum has learned and how we've adjusted what we do, and then really to also just think about how to use this precious time that I have in front of you to sort of share with you the ideas that feel like they have the most power, the most currency to really move us forward and inspire us this year. And this year, more than anything else, we are really committed to moving towards equity. We're not there, we're not close, but we really want to reinforce the idea that that's where we're going. So I've got a panel that's going to join me in a minute, but I want to take a few minutes with you just to tell you a little bit of the journey that we've been on over the past year. So you all know Ready by 21, you're here, it's on your bags, it's on your tags. And our tagline, which sometimes shows up under the logo and sometimes doesn't, is moving ideas to impact. And we're talking about doing that by really making sure we're changing the odds for young people. That it's really our job not to just celebrate young people when they happen to have overcome adversity and beat the odds because of things that happen to be in their path, but because we are systematically, as adults who have power, wherever that is, local, state, national, as adults who really maximize the spheres of influence that we have with young people, with our communities, with other leaders, to really change the odds so that young people systematically have the supports that they need. So we focus on leaders, as you know, and these gears have been with us since we started Ready by 21 back in 2008, if not before. Rita Irby, the co-founder, is a historian, and she's probably really holding her tongue to not correct me about the date when we first made the gears. But we have been using this idea that if we're going to change the odds for young people, we have to change the way we do business. And the only way that we do that is to systematically come together to figure out how we're going to make a shared commitment, how we're going to be personally accountable, how we're going to have our organizations be accountable, and how we're going to work together so that we are really changing the shape of communities in order to help young people achieve their outcomes. And so you've got a program, and I hope that you've looked at your program, in which your workshops and your sessions have been coded about whether they are really helping us move from equality to equity, whether they are helping us really not just talk about access, but talk about quality, one of the central themes that the forum has had, whether we're not just talking about completion, as important as it is for young people to complete high school, to complete post-secondary education, we are really talking about making sure that on that journey to getting a certificate or a degree, they are also building the skills, the competencies, the attitudes, the values, and the belief in themselves, and that sense of agency that they need to succeed in where they're going. And then while it's not on the slide, all of this has to be about shared commitment, but even more important, it has to be about engagement. We're not just looking for paper commitments, we're looking for people to be deeply engaged. We're here with this conference in particular, and I'm excited about it, because we always try to bring you great plenaries. We try hard to listen to you, and when you say, give us one terrific plenary speaker per session, don't give us a panel. We tried so hard to do that, and this year we completely failed. There will be no plenary session in which there are not at least 3 people. So bear with us, because there were so many partners that we wanted to join us so that it wasn't just one person telling their story. These are our partners telling the story we hope you are going to join us in. So we are here to honor children's potential. And we're delighted at this point in time, and we're going to talk about the fact that I think we are at a unique point in time, that we have no choice but to honor children's potential because the science tells us that the skills and talents exist in a potential state in every children, no matter where they start, no matter what their journey is and how many setbacks along the way, and that we can actually not only help them and help them recover from trauma, we can unleash that potential in every child if we create the right kind of environments. So the science of learning and development, this incredibly rich work that's been going over the past couple years to bring together everything we know from brain research and everything else that I'm sure you've been aware of, it is being boiled down into a basic fact. And that fact is not just that we need to increase our commitment to social and emotional learning. The fact is we need to acknowledge 100% that learning is social and emotional. That if young people don't feel socially accepted, If young people don't feel emotionally safe, we will never know what capacities and assets they have because they're not going to share them with us. This starts with trust. And so we're going to really spend the day unpacking that and asking what that basic reframed idea, learning is social emotional, how does that help us move faster towards the journey of equity? The science of learning and development tells us, and this is what we have to understand, whatever frames we put up, this starts with relationships. It moves towards safe and supportive environments. We then have to pour in rich instructional experiences that are helping young people learn the things that are important to them and to us. We have to know young people well enough that we can actually personalize or individualize the supports that they need. And then all of this has to acknowledge, because we know skills are malleable, we have to acknowledge that we have the opportunity to help young people build the skills that they need, social, emotional, cognitive, so that they can move through life better. But it has to be a complete package. We can't just pick one slice of that pie and say we're doing right by kids. So we're going to really push on that today. So we know that young people have potential. We know we need to acknowledge the potential, but we also have to acknowledge our adult biases, and they run deep. And the one that I want to share is a quote from Tom Akiva, who's here in the building, in the room somewhere. There's Tom. Tom is another of those folks, although I still win. Tom is another of those folks that has a long history with high scope, including going to the Perry Preschool, which Dave Weichert started, to really bring this idea of active learning forward. He tried to say that because he went to preschool, he was connected to high scope more than I am, but he lost, because he wasn't even born when I was a counselor at high scope. So this runs deep. So I just want you to read that slide, which comes from a paper that Tom and I and a colleague are putting out, but we put it up because this is the hard work. How do we disentangle learning and education from schooling in ways that center and promote equity? That's the conversation we want to have. Not just acknowledging that social and emotional skills are important, not just acknowledging that there are things we can do to be more explicit about instruction, but acknowledging the fact that we have preferenced one institution over many others in young people's community and in their lives, and that we are now trying to hold that institution more accountable for integrated learning and development. But we have to push and advocate for them to move forward while also trying to adjust this imbalance of acknowledging that young people spend their time in lots of settings, that learning happens everywhere, and that there are adults in those settings who have been leading with relationships that we can learn from. So that's what we really have to be working on. Now, again, you get the idea that I'm old. So I've been down this journey before. And I want to tell you, it's hard. I've tried it many ways. You can buy me a cup of coffee or a beer, and I'll tell you that every 10 years we come up with a new strategy for really trying to move these ideas about child and youth development into policy, into practice, into the mainstream, and most importantly, into schools in ways that stick and allow us to partner and think about whole child, whole community, not just as a nice slogan, but as something we're really trying to do. This is a huge undertaking. It has been tried before, but I'm optimistic this time around. I think we have an opportunity to do this that I have not seen in my lifetime. And again, I'm 67 years old. So the opportunity is because we really have the science galvanized that can force us into action. The opportunity is explicitly here in a way that it wasn't in 2002 when the National Research Council put out community programs to promote youth development, because that was written for the youth development audience. It helped us galvanize and have a common language about what we were doing, but it didn't go to schools. The work that the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development did, and you have the executive summary in your bags, you have a link to all the resources. We've got John Gompertz here personally from America's Promise, and America's Promise has taken over the charge of keeping all this wonderful information about how learning happens alive and available and bringing it into your communities in ways that we can grapple with it and continue to grow it and adapt it. So we're excited that not only do we have the opportunity to really bring the science into this, we're excited because we have receptivity inside of K-12 for ways to think differently, ways to act differently inside of that system, and ways to act together with the community that we need to leverage. So, very optimistic. Again, we've got the Seed Youth Development Work Group. You have this briefing in your package. The commission started out with a K-12 focus. They brought in partners from the community, from youth development organizations, from health, from civic and social justice organizations, employers, to say, we know you're a part of that ecosystem, but we said, you need to know more about us. And so they embraced us and supported us as we wrote the briefing, issue brief in your packets about what it is that these partners do. We're not just out of school. We're sometimes in school. We're in the buildings with you. We're working with your staff. Lots of organizations are working on this, and we wanted to make sure we had a frame. When you look at your packets and you look at that briefing book, and we'll talk more about this on and off throughout the conference, you cannot love the picture. I don't frankly love the picture, but what it does for us is it organizes the pieces of information that are critical. It puts young people and their families at the center. Not the system, it puts young people and their families at the center. It acknowledges, as the Chicago Consortium has done so well, and you have their infographic in your bags as well, it acknowledges that learning happens in homes, in schools, in community organizations, and with peers. We often forget that peer learning group is an important place. It acknowledges and begins to tell us that we can't just talk about systems or big things like school and community. If we're going to come at this from a young person's perspective and a family's perspective, and we're talking about getting to equitable learning environments, we need to name the learning environments in a much more specific way. Where am I? Am I in my algebra class? Am I at soccer? Am I in the library? Am I on an unsafe playground in my neighborhood? Where am I? And what kind of learning might happen or might not happen there? And if there are adults there, what is their responsibility and orientation toward me? What do we know about the places where young people spend their time? Because if we're going to have an equity agenda, we actually have to start to acknowledge all of those places. Because if learning is social and emotional, and I have a bad experience over here, I will bring that into the learning environment that you set up. You can't not acknowledge it. So a big deal that we wrote an issue brief, a big deal that we developed recommendations, a big deal that this got in the water enough that the graphic got all the way into the big report, A Nation at Hope. So I'm optimistic because we were able to really come in, and when I say we, I mean all of you. This was a conversation in which there are lots of folks in the room who were explicitly a part of that conversation, as youth organizations, as commissioners, as part of the Council of Distinguished Scientists, educators, part of the partnership, but we were really representing the wealth of information that we got from you all in that room and pushing hard to get that ecosystem to come to life. I'm even more excited, however, that we've been able to bridge what sometimes felt like a gap between two acronyms that most people don't understand, SEED and SOLD. And so not only did we spend a huge amount of time with the SEED Commission, we also really got to know the research coming out of the science of learning and development and got to know the partners. And so I'm delighted that also in your bag, you're going to see some videos from Pamela Cantor in a minute, but you have a link to this resource list. And it isn't just a resource list, it's a welcome letter. So I want to sort of, again, highlight some of the words in that letter because the forum, and the forum, again, is you guys. It's not just me. It's not just our staff. The forum, representing the wealth of resources and knowledge and experience and commitment that's in communities, has been asked officially to join the group that's really supporting the science of learning and development. And we're also then personally partnering with Turnaround for Children to figure out how to really make sure all of the science is coming out very clearly that it really needs to be brought into where young people learn and develop inside and outside of schools. And when you see the videos in a minute, you'll understand why that's so important to be able to get that message that all this wonderful information about the brain research needs to be actively brought to young people, to families, and to all of the places where young people spend their time. You all are excited as field leaders. I got Suzette's permission, well, I got it after the fact, but I got Suzette's permission to put a quote from her up on the slide. We have been going around since October talking about the findings and the recommendations and the framing that's coming out of the commission, not claiming that it's perfect, but claiming that we can use it in the same way that we use the National Research Council work to have a consensus-driven leverage point that helps us understand and promote what we do. So in your bags, you have a cheat sheet, a 4-page cheat sheet that gives you those graphics so you can see them because they have incredibly small print. You have a flyer from Marita Irby's shop, the Big Picture Approach Training and Consulting, to talk to you about ways that we have been testing out over the past couple years that help you not just come to the national meeting, but actually take the lessons home. And you've got a range of other things that you're going to hear a little bit more about some of our partners. But we're excited about this not just because we're helping you. This work over the past year has helped the forum. We went back and revisited and recommitted and reaffirmed the importance of the key ideas that undergird the forum's work. And so you have a key ideas page in your programs that looks like that page and that really sort of acknowledges the value of the theory of action that the forum has been using successfully for the past 20 years. And we have recommitted to our core strategies that really are how do we help you all as leaders move forward faster, whether you're trying to improve and align policies, you're planning and partnering for impact, or you're really trying to strengthen practices and programs. The forum has lots of logos and lots of projects and lots of initiatives, but they all come together in support of one or more of these big strands that we know have to be woven together if we're going to change the odds for young people. But my optimism about the opportunities that we have and about the open doors that we have to start this conversation, my optimism is tempered. And because I'm going to alliterate, I'm going to tell you why it's tempered. Extremely optimistic that we can change the odds for young people. Right? However, I'm concerned because as much as we have an opportunity to bring the science of learning into this space, if we don't bring it into this space to talk to young people and families and advocates in a way that acknowledges and affirms their right to be outraged, we are going to fail. We can't just say, here's the new science about brain research. Here's the science about learning environments. Stop being concerned that your kids don't have science labs or AP courses or certified teachers or a library, and just say, wow, if we could just help them build social and emotional skills, they would learn better. True, important, but we have to figure out how we bring this opportunity to really affirm the basic things that we know about trust and relationships and skill building and giving young people individualized supports. How do we bring that into the basic education advocacy agenda that we have made very little progress on? So how do we connect our optimism to justifiable outrage? The second thing, we've got this open door opportunity, but I'm concerned that with this open door opportunity, we may be outpaced because we haven't been studious about this science of learning in the broader fields that we represent. We're not always comfortable understanding how to come into conversations with schools. And because we haven't had the same systemic resources to build up supports in communities, if we really do generate the demand that the National Commission asks for, that every young person has the right to high-quality after-school and summer opportunities, I'm not sure we can get there. We haven't been handed that challenge before, so we need to be honest about that. We also need to be honest about the fact that while it's been an advantage sometimes to be outside of schools, we have to now be prepared to come in and really help them and help us think about what it means to be strategic partners, not just transactional partners. So optimistic, yes. Tempered, yes. But the main reason I'm a little concerned about kicking into another 10-year push to get us to change the odds for young people is that I am 67 years old, and at some point, I really would like to slow down. Not quit, not retire, just slow down a little bit. And to do that means that if I am going to really sort of have us on this marathon and be a part of this journey with you on this marathon, which often includes some serious sprints when we see an opportunity and we have to go after it, I had to get in shape. So on New Year's Eve, when most of us sit down with a glass of wine to set our New Year's resolutions, I bought a personal trainer. Because if you guys are going to have me running around like a chicken with my head cut off, I needed to be in shape. So I am pleased to announce that I am the client of the month for March. Woo-hoo! In my high scope t-shirt, because I'm with you on this journey. I'm owning it. Are you owning it with me? Yeah. Are you owning it with me? Yeah. All right. So with that, I'm committed. You need to sign up to do whatever you need to do to be both in the marathon and ready for the sprint. What do they call that? High intensity interval training. We need to be sort of ready to just jump in there and do it. So I want to get us kicked off now with 2 video clips from Pamela Cantor, who truly regrets that she can't be here, but I can tell you we're going to be delighted by the fact that we have Michael Lamb, who's a part of her team. What I want you to do is to listen to these carefully. Each one of them, there are 2 of them. They're each about 2 minutes long. I want you to have your pen out. I want you to listen carefully, and I want you to, even if you've heard the science before, I want you to write down the words or phrases that really resonate with you and tell you that there's a way that we can communicate this information clearly and powerfully to the people who need it. So let's tee up the clips.
The Science of Learning and Development Initiative came together to answer a question. What science should we pay attention to in order to understand how learning happens?
Good morning. Have a good day.
The Science of Learning and Development is really an attempt to synthesize a huge body of knowledge that's accumulated over many, many years from the learning sciences, from psychology and anthropology and brain science, and put all of that together and understand how people, in fact, develop,
And what else?
and how they learn.
There are a few core principles that define all of human development. The first is malleability, the unique property of the brain to change in response to relationships and experiences. Neural tissue is the most susceptible to change of any tissue in the human body. When children are born, their brains are not fully developed. The development of the brain actually continues into young adulthood. It is relationships and experiences that drive the development of the brain. If children have the experience of adversity, they will have uneven development of foundational skills, like self-regulation, relationship skills, that are prerequisites for more complex skills, like perseverance and self-direction. These are the children who are at risk to fall further and further behind. But what's most interesting is that a child can become a productive and engaged learner from any developmental starting point as long as we intentionally build those skills.
Turn to your table group and discuss this. Come up with a statement.
When we're able to combine social, emotional, affective, and cognitive development together, we are creating many, many more interconnections in the developing brain that enable children to accelerate learning and development.
We got this, guys! We got this!
As educators, we have an extraordinary opportunity to shape the developing brains of children and to create that kind of stimulus that drives the integration of the brain.
Good. So hopefully you had your pens out. I'm going to give you one more clip. You wrote down some things that you heard that you liked. Did you hear, were there some things you didn't hear that you expected to hear? So keep listening. One more clip, and then we'll get our panel started. Next clip.
Adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. Children under stress will have release of the hormone cortisol, and cortisol has effects on the learning center of the brain, which is the limbic system. At the same time, if children have a buffering relationship and the release of the hormone oxytocin, this will oppose many of the negative effects of cortisol and result in some of the resilience that we see and a normalization of brain architecture. If we're going to design schools that develop a learner who can learn anything, then that school needs to be designed for children who will come to school at different starting points. stress and trauma cause uneven development of certain kinds of critical skills and mindsets that kids need for learning. So if we design those into a school environment so that things like self-regulation and executive function and growth mindset are things that we can actually build, then in effect we've created schools that'll have the physical and emotional safety, the sense of belonging, the relationships, and the intentional development of the skills and mindsets associated with learning. The story in developmental science is an optimistic one, and it rests on the fundamental property of the brain that is its malleability. Negative things in children's lives can certainly do harm, but positive things can restore children to a healthy developmental path. More importantly, if we provide integrated developmental experiences for children in schools, we will not only enable them to recover from the effects of trauma, we will unleash the potential that exists in every single child.
Great. So I'm going to invite Hal and Michael to come up. And while they're coming up, I'm going to ask Rita to grab the mic and see if anybody wrote down a couple of words that they want to share. What stood out?
Anybody want to? Oh, there we go. Okay. We had some scribblers over here. Monica, darling.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Marie Jones with the Forum for Youth Investment in Weichert Center, a field consultant. And I wrote down that stress and trauma can create uneven development, but positive things can restore children to a healthy developmental path. So I'm going to take that nugget and use it in a training I'm doing on trauma-informed care in June.
Great. Got one over here. Do you have your hand up?
We're the ones she's doing the training for. But since I raised my hand, I'm Shauna Hayward. Good morning, everyone, from Detroit, Michigan. Like Monica, the thing that stood out for me was that positive can restore, but also the next step, which she said, was they can also release potential. So I thought that was profound.
Great. One more?
One more. And one more over here. Last word.
Good morning, Dorothy Stiles, Communities in Schools of Atlanta. I too was similar to the other ones. I wrote down that adversity happens inside of the brain and the body. So as I go back to my students and staff, just getting them to understand, you got to make sure you connect the children so they understand what happened to them so you can move them forward.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, and Rita, there was one hand way in the back. Go ahead and grab that one, and then we'll kick off.
She wants me to get my steps in so I can keep up with her and all that exercise. All right, I think right over here.
Hi, I'm Ann Heiligenstein. I'm with Casey Family Programs, and I'm from Austin, Texas. And one thing that struck me was there was a strong reference to how to build education to address those issues. And I think my question was, what are we doing to build that in children's families? And how are we going to do that? And that there are some new tools out there that I think would be very helpful in building that kind of strength and relationship within children's families long before they get to school.
Good. That's a perfect segue to the slide. It's why we want to have this conversation about we've got this powerful information. It's now being trained on how do we really transform schools. And the question is, if we go back to what's across the top of that, young people live in families. They live in communities that are supported informally and with a range of organizations that are focused on youth and development. And they are with peers, or they're with young people who are older than them who can be very influential. So if this information can be boiled down into the kind of basic things that we just heard that inspired you, how do we get that information not just inside a school, but how do we get it more broadly? But also, I'll just start with, how do we get it inside of schools fully? Like, there are a lot of adults in schools beyond the classroom teachers. What is it that we need to do to really make sure this information is getting out there? So I'm going to turn to Mike and see if you've got a quick answer to that question, Mike, since you kicked this off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I would just start off by saying that I was a middle school teacher on the south side of Chicago. So shout out to all of the Chicago folks here. But I never was exposed to any of the brain science that Pam was just talking about. And so what we thought of was that it was maybe just the 1 or 2 students that were having real challenges, the students that seemed to be going through the most things, just maybe 1 or 2 in the corner. But what we're really starting to understand now is just how normal it is to experience adversity. And on the other hand, our entire education system is not set up with that reality. And so I think that's the first thing that I would say is we actually need to deeply understand the impact of adversity, and that it's not just for 1 or 2 students who are your highest flyers, but that it is actually normal to experience adversity and stress.
So normalize the idea of adversity so we can normalize building environments where the adults in those environments understand how to deal with it, and not deal with it in a pathological way, but deal with it in a holistic way about supporting environments. So give us a little bit, since I know your slides, give us a little bit about sort of what those numbers are.
Yeah, well, the reality is that the look of a classroom is changing in America. And so this is some research that The Atlantic did to really paint a picture of what the average classroom looks like now. And some of those data points really stand out to me as a former classroom teacher. Just that 7 of the average classroom in America were growing up in poverty right now. That 6 are victims of abuse. When you really think about that, that 6 little guys and gals in your classroom are victims of abuse, but we don't structure our school system with that in mind. What would be different if we knew that that was true? What would be different if we knew that 6 of the little faces in front of you had experienced abuse? How would we reprioritize relationships? How would we reprioritize the impact of context around them that can buffer them from those experiences to reach their ultimate full potential? And so it first starts off with us understanding how much our classrooms are changing. Okay. I think the other thing that I would just talk about is this idea of normal. This is research done in Washington State, so shout out to the home team here as well. And again, this idea that adversity and stress is something that just a few students experience, and we need to have our deep individualized supports for just those few students, really doesn't hold up under the scrutiny of the research. This research shows that actually the majority of students have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, fully 80% in this study, and that a third had experienced 4 or more. And the data on having experienced 4 or more is profound. If you have experienced just 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, if unbuffered, you are 32 times more likely to have learning and behavior problems in school. Like, that's not 32% more likely, that's 32 times more likely. What would be different if we actually operated and built a system assuming that data? What would be different about the first 5 minutes of the day? What would be different about how we structured our classrooms, how we prioritized relationships that can buffer students from those experiences? If the brain science tells us a fully optimistic story of what's possible, then we must design our systems using science at the core.
So Hal, you're with the National Urban League, and obviously the National Urban League is known not just for its advocacy, but also for its commitment to making sure young people and families have places to go in their communities that are safe and supportive. Is this news? Do you all are Urban League programs that are working in communities naturally understanding this adversity? What do we do with this information? Again, bringing it into places where the numbers may look worse than that, but how do we bring it in a way that does not pathologize?
I mean, I think that's the central question. So, good morning, everyone. I think for the National Urban League and many of our partners, but particularly those of us in the National Urban League who work in local communities, it really is a reframing of the work and understanding that we're using school system and education system interchangeably, and those are not the same things. Those of you who I've met over the years will have heard me say this a number of times, but schools don't have communities, communities have schools. So if you start with the process that all the institutions in a given community are about education, are about learning, are about development. When you begin in that place, it's very different than to say, how do I help the school do its work? And instead say, how do institutions in a community help young people thrive, learn, develop? Similarly, what's often left out of these conversations is what do adults need to do in order to make communities welcome. Simply scaffolding social, emotional, and academic learning, sold research, every child can learn, all these very important research perspectives, actually practice perspectives, simply scaffolding them on our current setup, our current way of engaging with students, with parents, leads teachers to say, well, this is another thing that you're asking me to do. This is another thing. Now you're asking me to be a social worker. No, I'm asking you to be an educator. But I'm also not asking you to add this as one other thing in your toolbox. I'm saying you need to rethink the way you engage with parents, with families, with communities, with your peers. And if you're able to do that, we can have a conversation about getting to equity. Simply saying, you know what, I'm going to point to these 2 or 3 exemplars of young people who have really tough circumstances, and we've been successful working with them, but changing nothing else about the way we work, says that these young people are important. They have perspectives that are meaningful. They have life events that are impactful and meaningful, but it doesn't change the way I interact with all the other students. I'm just looking at these factors as something else I can apply, but not changing the way I work, the way I've set up my classroom, the way I've set up my curriculum, the ways in which I understand that there are barriers in the school that prevent young people from being successful. It isn't simply about helping young people overcome these obstacles. It's about helping them recognize. It's about helping them dismantle. It's about being active and in an ongoing process so that things like zip code, things like single parent family status are not predictive of youth success. It's a factor, but right now they're entirely too predictive and we are entirely too comfortable with that.
We clearly agree. So there's one word that we were talking about words that we heard and phrases that we heard in Pam's sort of couple of clips, and Pamela is an amazing speaker and pulls this information together. So when you look at the resources, you're going to see lots more that you can pull from her and other folks that have been doing this work. The word that I didn't hear, and I haven't heard either of you say, is curricula. Mm-hmm. And so I want to ask that question, and I want to sort of tee that up again from Turnaround. I want to sort of tee that up with a quote from one of your teachers. And again, it's, I'm coming to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. You all can read the rest of it. 2 questions for you all. One, if that power is really what we're talking about, making sure adults know they have, to actually, sort of make young people miserable or joyous, help reduce the impact of the cortisone or add to it, if they know they have that power, A, how do we really make sure they know what to do with it? And B, because you've got this wonderful slide that says the power that you carry, how do we go back to Hal's point and make sure that we expand the you? How is you not just they? This is what they do to my kids. How does you become we? What do we do with this basic information? How does it connect to the current push, which is a strong push to make sure that as we're acknowledging the importance of helping young people build and develop social, emotional, and cognitive skills, we're often bringing this in through curricula. Where does that fit? How do we make sure all adults who work with young people have this power?
Well, it's a lot.
I don't ask small questions, just big ones.
I think part of it is in the pre-service and then ongoing professional development and training. I was fortunate enough this morning to run into an old grad school colleague that I hadn't seen in 28 years, aging us both. I won't call you out your name. But one of the things I took away from that time was those who were trained to be principals and those who were trained to be superintendents would often tell me how they don't teach you how to partner well. in superintendent school. They don't tell you that it's necessary. They don't tell you what is possible, what it means for your work. And similarly, I think understanding that we're coming out of an era where too much of the push was teacher-proof education, that if you just rolled out the right curricular tools, anybody who could read could yield success with their students. So there's no teacher agency, there's no interaction, there are no relationships. Those kinds of stances mean that you are unable to bring in just the kinds of teaching, learning, development that we care about on an individualized basis, and assumes prevalence is the same as equity, right? That if everybody has access to the same high quality content, if the teacher doesn't know how to interact with it, the teacher doesn't know how to adjust it based on young people's circumstance and their interests, then, well, that's too bad. What I would like to believe is that a certain amount of agency, a certain amount of disentangling is necessary regardless of curriculum, but that is only possible if people coming in have been trained to recognize that they themselves can impact the lives of young people beyond what any script might say. We are slowly getting out of that, I would say slowly, but we are left with a generation of teachers who perhaps don't know how to do it. A generation of principals who were former teachers who don't know how to support that work. And when you're in a system, an education system, a school system, if you don't have enough people who know how to move from a point where standardization is the way in which we've been trained, how do you move people to excellence by helping them understand the science, but also the ways in which people all around them have been doing this, right? The fear I have is that this will become fetishized, that this will be another way to say, well, a few people can do this, it's brand new, we don't know, we don't have examples. Instead, I believe in every school, in every learning environment, including the people, the programs in which people here operate and work, there are people who have always been doing this. There are programs in classrooms that have always had this. And if we can talk with them about what it's taken to get to that point, to maintain that, where they'd like to go next, I think that's a better starting point than believing that nothing can be done until everybody knows how to do this brand new thing that no one has ever heard of before.
So Michael, you've been doing this in schools and bringing this idea in, and this is your slide. How do you get this, even inside the school building? What does it take to get a school to a place where every adult in the school believes that they have that power? And where do curricula fit in, and what else does it take? How do we realize Hal's goal?
So if we're building off of the premise that you just talked about, there's a couple of key ideas that the science actually says. And one is that talent is actually everywhere. However, our system is currently set up as if its goal is to identify the talented ones, as opposed to a system that's designed to lift up the potential and talent that is within every single child. And that's what the science tells us. The second thing that I would say, too, is that we're also talking a lot about kids and the adversity that children go through, but you don't get a clean slate of aces when you turn 18. And for adults who have experienced adversity as well, they're a critical element of all of this, too. They have stress that they may have worked through or not. They may understand the science, they may not. And oftentimes, unfortunately for children, the school experience is an additional adverse and stressful experience for them. That it's not the adversity and stress and trauma happening in the home and then they come to school where nothing bad happens. We are currently today increasing the levels of adversity and stress on children through the actions and the words and the practices of adults in the system. And so we really try and spend a lot of time helping adults really understand the extent to which they are making it harder for children to unlock their potential, or the extent to which they're actually making it much more likely. This is the power of the phrase that you all have as your mantra, this idea of changing the odds. To the extent that we keep the burden on an individual child to overcome, we are maintaining a system of inequity. But if we can actually use science to change the odds, so it's actually likely for a student who has experienced adversity to not just make it through, but to become resilient and to overcome all of their obstacles and actually thrive, then we're talking about an equitable place. But I would also build on something else you said, that there's so many things that are going on right now in the lives of children, and we can't just put the burden on them to be resilient. We have to continue to call out, like you did, as one of your major worries, the factors that are making it much more difficult for children to be able to succeed. That doesn't mean that we limit our expectations of them. It means that we have to be really honest about the ways in which we are making it really hard for children who are otherwise very high potential, very talented to be able to succeed. And so our work really grounds in adults. We actually spend very little time with students themselves because we're aware of just how much power adults carry. When we talk about them having the opportunity to shape the developing brain of a child, that they can actually change the biochemistry of a child's brain in the moment, they have these kind of, oh my gosh, moments where they think back to all of the words that they said to children over the last however many years of their career, and they start to realize, wow, did I spend that time building a brain, or did I spend that time making it much harder for those children?
So I want to push you on that, push both of you, because I think you've got nodding heads out there that we need to be bringing in this very stark reality that adults have the power to really do this micro work of helping to reshape young people's brains by just what they do. How do you, when that young person walks through that door, again, another one of your wonderful pictures, when that young person walks through that door into school, she's not just walking into one environment. She's walking into an environment that has a lot of other doors. She may open the door to the math class, she may open the door to the cafeteria, she may open the door to the counselor's office or the library or the principal's office because she got put out of class for being a problem and sent to the principal's office. She may open the door and walk out onto the playground, which is supervised or not supervised. When you say adults have to know this, how concretely are you making sure that they know it? And are you talking about all of the adults? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most amazing aspects of our growing partnership is this idea that the science of learning is not the science of schooling. It's the science of learning. And that learning happens not just in school buildings, it happens everywhere. And so this is what I think the potential of this partnership could be. And as that child walks through that door, wherever it is, it could be a school building, it could be an after-school class, it could be a home, it could be anywhere. They're carrying around this backpack of experiences that they've been through, and they don't drop it at that schoolhouse door and say, okay, the learning me is ready, I'm here. They carry that backpack around into the hallways, the classrooms, the cafeterias, and ultimately their seat at the learning table. And we as educators need to fully understand the implications of that. And we need to understand the potential that each and every child has if we think of this as the science of learning and development, not just the science of schools.
So how do you do that? I'm going to push you until you give me an answer.
Yeah.
How do we do this?
Yeah.
You're in schools doing this. How do you get to the folks in the cafeteria? How do you engage and reorient the counselors and the librarians and the health professionals whose numbers have been decimated to the point that even if they understand this stuff, they may not be set up to use it. What are we doing? Let's come outside the building in a minute. But what are we doing to really engage all of the adults in the building in this conversation? I mean, practically, give me some examples of what you're doing in a turnaround school.
So, not to too selfishly plug my workshop later today, where you will get tons of practices.
You can plug it, but you still have to answer for the rest of the people.
But the most important thing is that we help people wear a lens. And there's all sorts of practices and strategies that we'd use. But the most important thing is that they begin to wear this lens, and that's the lens of the science of learning and development. And if they can start to wear that lens, they can see every single interaction with a child as an opportunity to build trust or erode trust. Pam talked about stress and the impact of cortisol. And all of her research shows that stress is highly impacted by trust, and that trust is the antidote to stress. And so if you can wear that lens and see if any interaction I'm having, if any words that I'm saying to a child, if that is actually building trust or eroding trust, That is the key primary goal of an interaction with a child, if you're thinking about the implications of the science of learning and development. And that has to do with the first 5 minutes of the day. We have schools in DC that we've started to work with who call those first 5 minutes intake, which is what you call someone entering a prison system. And so if you are truly wearing this lens, you see every single moment as an opportunity to actually shape an experience for a child in a way that promotes healthy development or in a way that actually interrupts and impedes their healthy development.
Hal, could we bring this lens into other places in the community? I mean, do people already naturally have this lens? I mean, one of the things that we know and why we're excited about figuring out how we broaden the definition of where learning happens and broaden the definition of the adults who really could be empowered with these lenses is that those adults look a lot more like the kids that they're working with in those community settings than they typically do in the school. So is that lens already built in, or do they need glasses as well? What's going on here?
Oh, they certainly need glasses as well. I would add that our working definition of education is teaching, learning, and development wherever it takes place, not just in the building. What we see is many of the community programs that we work in, that we found, that we lead, are understood by the people who lead them, people who work in them, the parents, and even some of the participants as antidotes to what they experience in schools, in the traditional school and school day. That doesn't mean that all the practices we would want are well understood or well executed in these spaces. It means that perhaps they are more open to continuous learning and understanding that they may be a bit more advanced than what you might find in a school building, but they certainly need to understand their practices and their content and their relationships. There are places where you can go in and find as much hostility to parents, to families, to circumstance, the politics of respectability in these community settings as you would find in the worst school setting that you can imagine. So these are spaces that can be more flexible, that can certainly work differently. I think there are people, educators in those spaces, who are more likely to find a home to do all the things that we would like them to do that are there, but everyone in that space was experienced education and schooling as something very different from what we imagine. And so they have to overcome their own training and education and work in order to be successful and impactful. And that's an active intrusion. Right? That's the kind of training and settings such as this that are going to be incredibly important, not just for an individual to be impactful, but for them to find a community and help move things forward in any particular organization, out of school time setting. And we also need to understand that young people are coming to us for different things. If you're coming for sports, if you're coming for job development, you're coming for career and technical education, a STEM class, whatever it may be, there are practices there that help them get both the ways in which the content and knowledge you want them to get as advertised, and then the kinds of things that are going to make them feel whole and successful, to be agents in their own learning. That doesn't come naturally, and that not just emerge out of a setting. That has to be grown and nurtured and supported in the same kinds of ways.
Good. All right, so I'm gonna shift us over to talk a little bit about policy. Make sure we've got 10 minutes left for questions. So there is a mic somewhere out there on a mic stand. So if you've got a question, you want to get up there, you can start to sort of line up. And I also want to say that we're going to get more specific about this conversation of exactly what do we do to build the kind of adult capacity we're talking about in the afternoon plenary. So Steve Fleischman, who's our incoming board chair, but more importantly is the just recently retired CEO of Education Northwest, is going to facilitate another exciting panel That'll have Valerie Kinlock, who's from the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. She's the dean, and she's ready to talk about how we retool. Someone mentioned how do you sort of retool, starting with teacher education moving forward. We're going to have Jonathan Raymond, whose book is in your bags, who is the former superintendent of the Sacramento Unified Public Schools, who took this conversation, and especially that conversation about how do you empower families and put families and kids first into real life, sort of moving the ideas to practice. And we're going to have Camille Farrington from the Chicago Consortium for School Research talking to us about how we really partner and bring this research into schools. So we're going to get more concrete with each of these sessions. But let's turn for a second to another piece that you have in your bags, which is the National Urban League with colleagues just put out their report on looking at the ESSA standards across the states. And most of us know that there is this opportunity to sort of build in a fifth indicator and begin to have the conversation. So Hal, tell us quickly, where did these 12 indicators come from? How did you all develop them? And then obviously you can pull us out and look at it. Were there any surprises in how well school districts or state schools were doing?
Yes, thank you. So the indicators come from our work in the Equity and Excellence Project. So that's a project we started about 8 years ago to help prepare our affiliate CEOs, their partners, faith-based leaders, parent groups, even groups of young people, in how to engage in education reform, policy, advocacy, and engagement. How to demystify the jargon. And what we imagined was that there were indicators of equity we needed to be focused on, but we needed people to understand writ large what was at stake. What were the things that were going to drive equity? These 12 were things that resonate with our Equity and Excellence Project, but importantly, in work all across the country, help us understand very few places are going to have all 12 as top of mind initiatives, but they're going to exist everywhere. We're going to have some folks who are really focused on subgroup performance. That's what the principal, superintendent, state superintendent are going to be focused on, but we can't lose sight of the others. These 12, for us, we received a lot of pushback, not just from the advocacy community, but from states, because the law says, the Every Student Succeeds Act, doesn't call for any of these. And we said, well, so what? Like, this is what we're gonna need to achieve equity. Why would we focus on what the law demands you have to say about something, as opposed to what we know is necessary to actually achieve equity? So a number of people, very smart people, said, don't release this because you're going to confuse everyone and people will hide behind, well, the law says. It's like, but that's precisely what we want. We want people to be able to explain why their plans, 300, 400, 500 pages, are explicitly silent on these things when these are the things we know, among the things that we know, will achieve equity. The second part of your question about surprises. So the biggest surprise for me was how many people called after the report was released last week to say, I live in X state. You gave them a green, which means they're well on their way to equity. I said, well, no, that's not what it means. So the paper, the plan says they're well on their way. They're very expert in writing. It doesn't mean anything about implementation, about the series of investments that must follow, the changes in practice that must follow. So we are very careful to say these plans lay out a way forward for this particular state that is great, we see a lot of promise, that are adequate, and where they are silent or we see specific problems in the ways they've approached equity. It says nothing about what's going on and that these are systems themselves that we must follow and say, this is great. If they live up to their promise, will be another step forward. Understanding that many of these plans were written under different governors, different state secretaries of education, different chiefs. It says nothing about what's going to change in a given district. We're in that phase now. What's going to happen in a given school or classroom. So the plans, the indicators are what we hope people can follow up on, less about the scores. Scores are important at the moment, but if people become more conversant in the kinds of equity indicators that are going to matter most, I think we've had a successful launch of a program. We also don't want to get in a situation, though, where people understand equity as only these things. There are going to be unique frames in your school, in your classroom, in your state that are going to require people who are non-school experts to weigh in, to become involved, to begin to shape the policies, investments, and practices in districts.
All right, so now we're going to grab a couple of questions. I see two folks back there. I'm seeing, is that Tammy?
Yep, it's
Hi, Tammy.
me. Tammy Fields, Palm Beach County Youth Services Department. You touched on parents, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper on that. We know that a lot of parents also suffered trauma, and we've got generational trauma that's going on. The epigenetics show that there's changes from generation to generation going on in the brain. What are the recommendations for making sure we teach parents about this without placing judgment upon them that they have possibly done something wrong and adversely affected their children? Because I think it's a balance where we've got to remove that judgment. So I was looking for recommendations on that.
All right, and we'll bring that question into the afternoon session as well. I'm going to ask you guys to give short answers or say, I don't know. That's all right, too.
Yeah, I would just say that the frame has to be about empowerment. And to the extent that we feel like exposing people to the science can help empower them, then we should absolutely be doing that. And I think what often we use science to do is to label and to define and to diagnose, as opposed to empower. And from our experience, educators, parents are struggling with trying to make meaning of what's happening with their children. And so it's not like they're in this neutral state where they have no wonderings about what's going on. They're desperate to try and create the optimum conditions for their children to thrive. And so we would really, promote that the science can be a really empowering tool for anyone to start to understand, why might I be reacting this way? Why might I be responding this way? And oftentimes, if you look at the research around ACEs, it's highly correlated to the experiences that you've gone through that are not your own choices and your own actions. And the powerful thing about the original ACEs research is that all of those 10 ACEs are not things that the individual child did. It's not their bad choices. It's not the things that they did. It's the experiences that they went through. And so helping them understand that there's nothing wrong with them is a really empowering story for them to tell.
Next.
So I'm Rebecca Ackerman. I'm from Big Brothers Big Sisters of Middle Tennessee. And one of the question I had was, has anyone ever studied the ACEs scores of teachers and the potential for vicarious and secondary trauma and the potential impact that has on student outcomes? Because I think we talk about a two-generational approach when we think about parents and children, but if teachers, and I came from education and I moved into the out-of-school space, teachers are not given the training that social workers are and youth service providers are around compassion fatigue, around all of those pieces. They're not given any of that training, and so I'm just wondering if there's any study or work that's been done about that, and then potentially the impact of vicarious or secondary trauma on student outcomes in their classrooms.
So let's broaden the question to say teachers or other adults that are in educational positions, and let's limit it to, do you know of any research that's been looking at the correlation between trauma and the adults that are teaching our young people?
Yeah, there is early research. We would frame it all in terms of the impact of stress and what that does to anyone. And the example of this is, you asked about practices. Quickly, educators are starting to understand how their own stress and their own adverse experiences is playing out in their interactions with children. If you go into a school and you see a student struggling and there's a behavior issue moment and the student gets referred to the office and then they come back, almost never is there a warm, welcoming response by the teacher in that moment. And oftentimes they're still experiencing their own stress of that interaction. They're stressed about feeling like it's personal to them. They're stressed that they feel like this isn't something that I'm equipped to handle, and someone needs to do something to that child. That is where their mentality is at, and it's often influenced by the own stress that they've had in their own lives. So we had a principal who did some research on this themselves, and they noticed that only 8% of all of the moments of reentry of the children in their school, they sat there and looked at every single reentry, trailed their dean, only 8% of them had a warm welcome response of that child back into the classroom. And that teacher was stressed. That teacher was feeling the impact of that. So that has a huge impact on the entire rest of the day for that child. So I think this is critically important for us to really ground in adults and their experiences, not just in children.
All right, so we're going to at least hear what the questions are. We may not give you the answer.
Hi, Dana Godek. I'm an administrator in a very large school district. Our state was red. And I'm also a major ESSA geek, having been responsible to implement all of our federal programs in my district. So I've been tracking it. And now we're at the point in the evolution of ESSA where we have state plans and we have either indicators of equity or not. I'm curious about what national partnerships you're leveraging and your approach in that with like Chiefs for Change, Council of Chief State School Officers, CASTLE's Collaborating States initiatives. Can you illuminate that a little bit and give us some of that strategy? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So all of the groups you've named, yes. National League of Cities, National Governors Association, Council of Great City Schools. I think everyone that you can think of is a part of this conversation. I would not want to say we're in agreement about strategy or investment, but we recognize that it's necessary. We also spend a great deal of time talking with non-school experts in the same way. So as many of the faith-based coalitions, community-based coalitions, youth development coalitions that we can bring to this, we are. The policy conversation is complicated because we have all of the necessary actors there, very few of whom are familiar with the research. And so that's the starting point to get everyone to understand what's out there, what it actually says, and then we can start getting into implications and implementations. But in a complete agreement about the need for a diverse and deep bench of people thinking about this and working together on this.
And I know as you're doing that, Hal, that this whole question of where this information we've just been talking about, it doesn't just fit in to be a 13th indicator.
Right.
It really fits into all of these and being explicit about what it means to fit it in. We've got time for one last question or comment. Is that Vivian?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Vivian.
Hi. Thanks for a terrific conversation. Karen, you asked us early on what was missing, what we didn't hear, and so I'd like to suggest that I think what we haven't heard as much of are some of the upstream root causes of adversity and the burden of adversity and trauma for certain groups of kids and their communities. So issues around racism, structural racism, the very long historical reach of white supremacy, of homophobia and heterosexism, of the fact that we're in an era of growing economic inequality. And so as I think also about the next decade in this marathon that we're on, you know, I'm wondering how we can also bring in some of these larger structural forces that create these negative downstream outcomes and put certain communities and certain families and kids more at risk than others. And perhaps, here's one thought, you know, there's a whole science on racism and inequality that also needs to be brought to bear as strongly as the science on learning and development. So just a few thoughts about that.
Good, thank you. I'm not even going to allow us to get started in answering that question since we're officially out of time, other than to acknowledge you're absolutely right. And as we often do at our conferences, but we didn't sort of kick it off with this, when we put up our version of the fences, you know, the fences slide that everybody uses, we have acknowledged the fact that the playing field isn't level. So you've got the ground sloping down, but we also acknowledge the fact that the barriers are not even. And so the actual posts of the fence or planks of the fence actually slope up to acknowledge those different institutional and historical hurdles that are there. So extremely important to acknowledge those big sort of upstream conditions. Also important to somehow acknowledge, which is what we're trying to do today, the power of not just acknowledging those and saying we need to fix those, but in the meantime, what is it that we can do to really understand that when we are in the moment with children who have come through those upstream conditions, there are still some things we can do other than wait for those to be fixed. So that balance is what we're trying to get out and bring the science. Help me thank the panelists.